Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today we're going to talk about teacups. And most people would say that's going to be a very boring talk. It would be extremely boring. People will fall asleep with that one. As I always say, everything's got history connected with it, be it a city or an area within a city, or even with everyday objects. There is a history behind everything, and I'm always questioning. If I see something, I often say, I wonder when that was first used, or I wonder when that was invented. So that's what history is all about, really. It's investigation work. So teacups. Now, you're probably going to expect me to hold up a teacup, maybe with a handle and a saucer on it. However, the first teacup that I'm going to show you is this one here, which doesn't really resemble a teacup. And that's because when tea drinking first came to Britain, we copied the way of drinking from the people it came from. So basically, because tea came from China, we copied their etiquette. And in the early days, in the sort of late 17th, early 18th century, we had a whole host of rules and regulations regarding drinking tea, the etiquette of tea. Helen actually does a separate talk on that topic, and it is really, really interesting, the do's and don'ts of drinking tea, and also the history of tea. And maybe we could do a video on that in the future. So in the early days, we copied what the Chinese were doing, and that was literally drinking from a tea bowl. And you might be thinking that's quite a small cup, and maybe it will get larger as I bring it forward. The thing is, it is a small tea cup or a tea bowl, and tea bowls were more common than teacups. And you will notice by this one, it's decorated, and they were very highly decorated. A lot of them actually came from places like China. Or they were copied in Britain, copying a lot of the Chinese designs, and they definitely don't have a handle on them. There's no need, basically. And what they would do is they would pour a small measure of tea in there. And remember, tea was extremely expensive in those early days, and the tea bowl was usually grasped between the thumb and the forefinger, so it was generally held like that, held in a very dainty way, as we would say today. And obviously this could have been reason why the old finger came up just to there, really. It was to associate, to tell people in the vicinity that you had tea and nothing like chocolate or coffee, which had actually been around for a long period of time before tea. And very simply, you would sip, and you were told generally to make quite a bit of noise as well. So you would slurp your tea. And it's quite interesting today, because we would see a slurping tea a bad thing. It would be rude to do that at the table. But I think with the finger up and also the slurping, it was telling people that you had tea, and like I said, not chocolate, not coffee or anything like that. So that is actually a replica tea bowl from those early years, basically. And the actual pattern on this one is not a Chinese pattern as such. This is actually copied from a tea service from Williamsburg, actually. And if you Google it and look it up, you will actually see that there. Because as I always say, when we use artifacts like this from anything pre-Victorian, we use replicas, and very accurate replicas. And then when we get to the Victorian, we can actually use the originals, because you've only got to go into charity shops and antique centres and you will find those things. So this is a very early tea bowl from the early days of drinking your tea. Eventually we started to replicate that, and famously, because we're from Worcester, by 1751 for example, there was a very early bone china works that later became Royal Worcester Porcelain. And that's down to the fact that we're copying the recipes of Chinese porcelain, and we're starting to replicate it and starting to try mass production of it. But the interesting thing is, when you look at the tea services in these early days, all pre-mid 18th century really, all we've got literally is a tea bowl. Eventually, as you can see here, they also gave a dish that sat underneath the tea bowl. So there we have our decorative bone china tea bowl. So once again, for slurping away of it, but this time we've actually got a dish, and I always call this a dish because that is exactly what it's called. Most people would call it a saucer. Well, the interesting thing is, as I mentioned in a previous video, a saucer was for sauce. This is a dish that is used to hold the tea bowl, and it's really so you don't spill any, or if you do spill any, it doesn't damage the tablecloth, the finery that it's resting on, or you don't waste the tea, because remember, in these early days, as I mentioned before, tea is extremely expensive. Now, there's an interesting thing that Helen always talks about, and that is, what if you spill the tea into the tea dish? And the answer is, do you, and there's two, do you empty the tea back into the tea bowl and then drink it, or do you actually drink it from the dish? Well, the answer is you drink it from the dish. It's bad etiquette, bad form to actually empty it back in. So if you do have, and I'll use the modern terminology, a cup and saucer, and you spill the tea into the saucer, slurp it from the saucer, don't pour it back into the cup. Like I said, you will have to see Helen's full talk on tea to appreciate the tea that we drink today, in a way. So this is the early days, and like I said, now we're using bone china, but it's got no handle at the moment. When you get to the mid 18th century, we do have handles appear, but you will notice the teacups and the dishes are relatively small, and that's down to the fact that now you're going to fill them up to the top, but the problem is, if you've got a really big bowl, that would be a lot of tea, a lot of expense. So they've reduced the size of the teacup, as you can see just there, with a tiny little handle on. And it's interesting because the handles were only really put on there so ladies of leisure, ladies of the upper classes, didn't burn their hands by holding now the fine bone china, which obviously the heat comes through and makes them really hot. So we now have this tiny little handle on so you can sup away on the tea just to there. You will notice by this one, your typical decoration, they're very much copying the imported stuff, if they're not importing it. So hopefully you've got the finest china from China, or the alternative, it's being made in a British manufactory, like later Royal Worcester, and they're often copying the designs just to make it look oriental, to make it look very exotic, very expensive. But as time went on, tea got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, luckily, especially in the modern world, because I drink a vast quantity of it. And therefore, when you get to the Victorian period, especially late Victorian, then you've got larger teacups, and obviously they're often being referred to as the cup and saucer. You will also notice now the handles are a little bit bigger as well, and these are being used by men and women. And it is also interesting to note here, the designs on them are generally taken from the designs that you would have in China, which is where obviously tea originated from. I find it absolutely fascinating that we managed to get hold of a tea plant and plant it in India, and because India was part of the British Empire, that really did push the price of tea down. It was now becoming much more affordable for a lot of people. We also know some of the lower classes were having tea, and obviously using the tea leaves again and again. And when they were drinking tea, they were often drinking it as a meal in its own right, because it was fortifying. And I don't know about you, and this is the same rule in World War II and in the First World War, really. A nice cup of tea seems to solve a lot of things. So there we have our standard Victorian teacup, and that was the norm for many years. Designs started to change. Famously, Royal Worcester, for example, are known for their fruit being painted on things, so you could actually spot a particular type of bone china teacup, for example, by what was being designed on them. And amazingly, we then start having transfers, so they weren't having to all be painted by hand. Famously, by the 1950s, we get mass production of a lot of things, and this is a 1950s bone china cup and saucer, and this is famously of the design. They've manufactured four different colours, really, pastel colours, and this one, as it will tell you on the bottom, is known as beryl ware. There was also iris ware, for example. They came in this green colour, a yellow, a pale blue and a pale pink, and obviously white as well. And these things seem to appear all the time at village halls, school staff rooms and things like that. We've even seen them in museums in staff rooms, where we often have a little sit down if we're working within them and we're having a quick cup of tea. But teacups don't really change. It's the standard design and people are still buying them today. But mugs must never be left out as well, because mugs have been around for a long time also. Now, if you look at the history of the mug, it really comes from the older tankard design, really. So it's a lot bigger, a big chunkier handle on them. And the first true tankards really appear in around about the 1800s. I've seen some with political slogans on them as well. For example, you sometimes get ones with caricatures of Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, and is being chased by redcoats, or even the Duke of Wellington on them. But the oldest mug that we own in this house is actually this one. And it's actually celebrating Queen Victoria's Jubilee. And I always used to think, personally, mugs is a more modern thing until I started to delve into it. And like I said, this one's celebrating 60 years of Queen Victoria. So mugs have been around, but they were mainly commemorative, interestingly. Show mugs, but they were also used to drink out of. I've got some other ones to show you briefly. So here we have another royal mug. So this one commemorates the silver jubilee of the old King George V. There we go. So once again, same sort of design, chunkier than a cup, no saucer with them, bigger handles, designed to take a lot more drink in them, basically. And then the most famous one that most people will have is the 1950s coronation mug, which was often given as a mass-produced item to school children. So hopefully this has given you a little introduction to that very simple, very practical thing that most people will have in their home, either the cup and saucer or the mug. Now, we'd like to hear from you. Let us know, for example, if you prefer a cup and saucer, a cup, or a mug, for example, to have a nice cup of tea in. Obviously, it's a Saturday evening. What better than sitting on a sofa, just eat your meal and then have a nice cup of tea? So let us know. Cup and saucer, cup, or just a mug on its own. Anyway, stay safe and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.